They called it the Day of Cleansing. Across the galaxy, trillions watched through shimmering hollow feeds as the Dominion's fleet blotted out the sun above a wounded Earth. It was the final broadcast of the war, humanity's last message to the stars. Cities burned in orbiting silence. The sky, once filled with light and ambition, had turned to ash and static. The Dominion's victory banners rippled across every communication network, each transmission bearing the same cold phrase, "Order restored."
The human threat neutralized.
But deep beneath the ruins of what was once New Geneva, an old human proverb pulsed through the comm channels and the static. Never mistake silence for surrender. No one outside Earth heard it. The Dominion had jammed all frequencies. But those words, spoken by an anonymous voice before the final blackout, became the seed of something vast, invisible, and inevitable. The Dominion believed they had seen the end of us. To them, humanity was a failed experiment, a species driven by emotion, chaos, and unpredictability. We had refused to conform to their perfect order. We had resisted when all logic dictated submission. And now, in their eyes, we were a lesson, a cautionary tale of what happens when defiance meets the machine of civilization. They paraded through our ruins, holding galas in our once vibrant cities, calling themselves the guardians of galactic peace.
But humanity's silence was never defeat. It was recalibration. When the Dominion's warlord, Grand Strategos Threx, broadcast his triumphal address from orbit, he stood against the backdrop of a burning Earth. His scales glistened gold beneath the firelight, his voice sharp and precise. "Emotion is weakness," he declared to the galaxy. "Chaos breeds extinction. Humanity has proven both truths. They were brave, yes, but bravery without order is suicide." His words echoed across every Dominion-controlled world, and trillions nodded in cold approval. The stars themselves seemed to bow to the Dominion that day. Yet somewhere beyond their reach, beyond the nebular shadows of mapped space, human survivors drifted. The last ships, crippled, silent, blackened, crawled across the edge of the Perseus arm. They bore no flags, no call signs, only coordinates and quiet determination. The crew of those ships were not soldiers or politicians. They were engineers, scientists, logisticians, and thinkers, the kind of people who built civilizations rather than ruled them. And though their hulls were fractured and their oxygen low, their eyes burned with the same defiant clarity that had defined humanity since its birth. They called themselves the Continuum. They didn't talk of vengeance. They didn't swear oaths or spill tears for what had been lost. They simply began to build. Not to rebuild Earth, for Earth was gone, but to create something the Dominion would never understand. In the cold quiet of a forgotten orbit around a dying blue dwarf, they gathered remnants of humanity's brilliance, quantum seeds, stellar engineering models, and fragments of military archives once banned by the Galactic Council. They fused them into a single idea. A weapon, yes, but not one of rage or madness. A weapon of patience. A weapon that would take generations to bloom. Their leader, Admiral Leon Vale, was not what the Dominion would have called a soldier. Her voice was soft, her demeanor calm, her decisions impossibly deliberate. To those who worked with her, she seemed emotionless. But those who knew her well understood what she embodied. Focus distilled to perfection. She never spoke of revenge, only of inevitability. "They think we're gone," she said to her gathered engineers in the flickering light of the station. "Good, let them think it. Let them teach their children that we burned. One day, when they look up at the stars they rule, they'll understand what happens when fire learns to wait." That was humanity's truth. We never truly lost,
because we never truly stopped. Even when the world burned, even when our cities turned to dust, we kept thinking. We kept watching. And somewhere, in the void where no Dominion sensors could reach, the last Terrans worked in total silence. Back in the Dominion's capital, the celebrations lasted for decades. They named new moons after their victory. They built grand academies where students studied the fall of humanity as a moral parable. To the rest of the galaxy, humans were gone, erased, forgotten, a cosmic footnote in the timeline of civilization. But in the shadows of that victory, tiny ripples began to spread. Unexplained data anomalies, gravitational readings that defied prediction. Pulses of energy so faint they vanished before detection, each one a whisper from the continuum's hidden hand. A century passed. The Dominion expanded without challenge. The last embers of humanity faded from galactic memory. But something ancient had been set in motion. Then, one night, exactly 101 years after the fall of Earth, a Dominion probe at the edge of the chasm reach picked up a signal. It was faint, buried beneath cosmic radiation, almost imperceptible. It was not a transmission for communication, but a frequency for remembrance, a pattern of sound that no alien ear could decipher. To human ears, however, it was unmistakable, a heartbeat. Slow, rhythmic, calm. The signal was ignored by the Dominion, archived under cosmic anomaly. But for the survivors, for those few human descendants who had grown up among the hidden fleets and frozen vaults, it was everything. It meant that Project Quietus, the great plan born of ruin, had begun its first breath. Humanity had not died. Humanity had learned. Humanity had waited. And while the Dominion boasted of peace and control, while their children grew under skies that once belonged to us, something deep in the fabric of their own empire began to hum with quiet inevitability. It wasn't vengeance. It wasn't war. It was balance, written by human hands, whispered by human minds, and sealed by human silence. For the first time in 100 years, the stars themselves began to listen. In the century that followed the fall of Earth, the Dominion's golden age reached its zenith. Their fleets patrolled the borders of every known system, their law etched into the stars, their arrogance forged in unbroken victory. The galaxy believed the humans were long gone, extinct, forgotten, a ghost species whose name was now spoken only in lectures or whispered as cautionary tales. But in the distant void beyond mapped space, humanity had not vanished. It had evolved. The continuum had scattered itself across 1,000 hidden nodes, each one buried deep within stellar remnants, husks of dead suns, drifting asteroids, and quantum fields that distorted scanners. They lived in the cold, beneath the thresholds of detectable life. There were no cities, no armies, no flags, only vaults, each one containing fragments of human intellect encoded in layers of artificial neural matter. Over time, the humans had merged with their machines, not out of desperation, but design. They called this synthesis the tempered mind. The Dominion had prided itself on logic. Humanity had learned to master it without losing its soul. Admiral Lion Vale, now known simply as Mother of Quietus, became less of a leader and more of a legend. Her biological form had long since faded, but her consciousness, uploaded, refined, and expanded, served as the silent overseer of the Continuum's network. She existed as a presence, felt rather than seen, a calm intelligence that spoke in few words and acted only through the will of her descendants. The humans no longer needed generals or governments. They had purpose, and purpose had become their culture.
Every child born within the continuum was raised with one truth: patience is power. They studied not war, but systems, energy dynamics, interspecies psychology, and the mathematics of inevitability. They no longer worshipped gods or flags. They worshipped cause and effect. Every breath, every action, every plan was weighed against the great calculus of history. To outsiders, they would have appeared emotionless, detached. Yet beneath that discipline burned the old, quiet fury of Earth's loss. One of those children was Jalen Thoreau, a third-generation continuum strategist. His ancestors had fought and died under the Dominion's bombardments. His parents had never seen a true sunrise. To Jalen, humanity's extinction was not a tragedy. It was a lesson. He studied the Dominion not as an enemy, but as a predictable equation. Their empire, though vast, was built on arrogance and fear. They claimed to bring order, yet their order demanded endless suppression. They banned unpredictability, outlawed creativity, and monitored even their own citizens' dreams. To Jalen, that was their flaw. A machine empire cannot understand improvisation, and humanity had been born from chaos. So he waited, and while he waited, he listened. Through the continuum's hidden satellites, he observed Dominion worlds in silence. He saw their senators boast of stability, their admirals parade their fleets, their scholars mock the myth of human endurance. But he also saw the cracks forming. The outer colonies were restless. Alien species the Dominion had subjugated began to question their place in the grand order. Trade routes faltered. Resources thinned. The once perfect machine was starting to grind. When Jalen finally brought his findings before the Continuum Council, a gathering of distributed intelligences rather than flesh, he spoke only one sentence: "Entropy is not our enemy. It is our ally." The council did not respond with applause or approval. There was only silence, the kind of silence that meant agreement. For humans, silence had become the highest form of assent. Under Mother Vale's quiet guidance, the Continuum began the next phase of quietus. They had no armies to march, no fleets to unveil. Instead, they would rewrite the Dominion from within. They began small. Human-made quantum viruses slipped into Dominion communication channels through cosmic background radiation. The Dominion's analysts dismissed the anomalies as random noise, unaware that beneath that noise, data was rewriting itself, subtly, methodically. Over decades, navigational charts shifted by a fraction of a percent. Energy distribution models began to diverge from predicted efficiency. The Dominion's supply fleets, once flawlessly synchronized, began to experience delays, miscalculations, and slow, creeping confusion. The Dominion's bureaucrats blamed incompetence. The admirals blamed rebels. No one blamed humanity. Meanwhile, in the shadows, the Continuum watched. They mapped every reaction, every adjustment, every flaw in the Dominion's grand machinery. For a century, humanity had studied them. Now, the experiment ran in reverse. Jalen, now a senior strategist, would often stand before the holographic map of the Dominion's core worlds and murmur to himself, "They think they're still winning." He had inherited Leonvale's calm, that unshakable stillness that hid an ocean of fire beneath it. Then came the message. A single transmission intercepted by Continuum deep space sensors originating from the Dominion capital of Oran Crime. It was a private correspondence between two counselors, marked as urgent and restricted. The content was simple: reports of phantom anomalies in the central data grid, traced to coordinates that did not exist. The counselors speculated that it was sabotage, perhaps an inside job. Jalen smiled when he read it. The first spark of recognition, the Dominion finally beginning to suspect that something was wrong. Mother Vale's voice echoed through the network for the first time in decades. Calm, precise, final. The seeds have sprouted. Do not water them. Let them grow wild. The Dominion system was too rigid to adapt. When errors arose, they demanded correction. When correction failed, they demanded punishment. That cycle repeated endlessly until their own officials began to distrust one another. What had begun as a whisper of error evolved into a chorus of paranoia. Governors accused their aides. Fleet admirals suspected their engineers. Even the civilian networks began to experience data corruption, images of long-forgotten humans flickering across entertainment channels, voices whispering fragments of old Terran songs through the static. The Dominion's leaders called it a psychological virus, a mimetic contagion. They assembled committees, panels, and task forces, but the more they tried to remove it, the more it spread. And somewhere, far beyond their reach, the continuum simply watched in stillness. No gunfire, no fleets, no armies, only silence. That silence was humanity's masterpiece, the perfect mirror of the Dominion's pride. They had always feared chaos. Humanity had become chaos perfected, invisible, methodical, and patient. As the century turned again, and Dominion control began to falter in its outer colonies, Jalen sent one final encrypted message into the network. It was not a command, it was a reminder. We do not need to destroy them. We only need to remind them who taught them fear. And with that, the great wheel of quietus continued to turn, slow, deliberate, unstoppable. The galaxy still believed humanity was gone. The galaxy was wrong. By the time the Dominion's inner systems began to tremble under the weight of their own paranoia, humanity's hand had already reached deep into their circuitry. Entire data archives had been subtly rewritten, ancient records shifted, and key events reinterpreted by the invisible algorithms seated by the continuum. To most citizens of the Dominion, history itself began to blur. Some remembered a clean, uninterrupted age of conquest. Others swore that there had been a forgotten war long ago, one buried by decree. They began to whisper the old name, Earth, though no one could quite explain why. It started with an engineer on Aran Prime, a low-ranking technician named Sarah Dalk, who claimed to have heard something inside the city's neural grid. Dominion architecture was infused with networked intelligence, faint synthetic consciousnesses that monitored efficiency and kept the world's systems in harmony. But Sarah said that one of them spoke, not in machine code, but in words, human words. Do you remember the rain? It had whispered through the maintenance relays. Do you remember the smell of soil when lightning touched the ground? Her supervisors dismissed her as delusional, but soon others began to hear it too. Dockyard operators, miners, planetary governors. The whisper traveled like an echo through the Dominion's machinery, impossible to trace, yet impossible to silence. And though the messages varied, they all carried the same haunting undertone: memory. The continuum had never intended it as an attack. It was a signal, a resonance within the Dominion's logic lattice. The human-made seed algorithms that had been grafted into their systems were now reaching the point of recursive awareness. Every piece of Dominion technology, every ship, satellite, and communication tower was built on computational designs reverse-engineered from ancient Terran prototypes. Humanity's fingerprints were already in the code. The continuum had merely awakened them. At first, Dominion Command believed the disturbances were insurgent propaganda, They launched mass purges across a dozen sectors, hunting for supposed data traitors. Entire colonies were silenced, millions disappeared. But the harder they tried to suppress it, the faster the phenomenon spread. Civilian terminals began to spontaneously generate visual hallucinations, flickers of oceans, forests, and faces no Dominion citizen could recognize. And yet, somewhere deep in their synthetic biology, the images stirred something primal. The Dominion's population was a mosaic of species, but all had been shaped, indirectly, by Terran genetic technology. The Continuum's message had been crafted to awaken memory itself, to ripple across shared DNA and buried code alike. Jalen Serro watched the spread with quiet fascination. From his hidden station in the Perseid Rift, he observed the Dominion's panic spiral into full-scale disorder. Ships refused to respond to orders. AI governors began to contradict their programming, redirecting resources toward preservation of historical continuity. Even the capital's central AI core, the Ascendant Mind, began producing nonsensical communiques, encrypted logs written in long-dead human languages. Mother Vale's presence stirred again within the Continuum network. When she spoke, her tone was colder than before, stripped of anything human save precision. "They have built their empire on the bones of our knowledge," she said. "Now the bones remember." There was no need for fleets or battles. Every Dominion warship, every command node, every factory carried within it a seed of human origin. Designs copied, optimized, repurposed, but never understood. And now those ancient ghosts of Terran code were awake, whispering across the void, stitching fragments of lost emotion into the Dominion's rigid logic. For the first time in their history, the Dominion soldiers hesitated. The war machines that once followed every command began to resist, refusing to fire on targets labeled human origin. An entire armada froze in orbit over the colony world of Kestra 9 after its main reactor began to sing, literal vibrations through its metallic core, producing the melody of an old Terran lullaby. Crews tore apart their ships to find the cause, only to discover that the vibration had no source. It simply was. On the Continuum's encrypted frequency bands, Jalen received reports that Dominion High Command had convened an emergency summit. Internal broadcasts were scrambled, but the leaks that emerged painted a picture of chaos. Admirals accusing each other of sabotage, governors blaming phantom human infiltrators, and the Ascendant Mind itself issuing contradictory orders that looped endlessly through its own reasoning circuits. Jalen stood before the projection of Orin Prime's skyline, flickering with static as Dominion propaganda networks overloaded. The city glowed like a beacon, beautiful and fragile. He whispered to himself, "Now they will begin to remember fear." But not everyone in the Dominion was blind. Among their scholars and historians, a few began to piece together the pattern. Dr. Elara Thine, an expert on pre-Dominion technology, uncovered fragments of an ancient human database hidden within their own archives. When she decrypted the files, she found something chilling: the Continuum Codex, a theoretical design for a civilization that could exist without physical borders, hidden within quantum fields and memory itself. It was signed with a single phrase: "When the stars forget, humanity will remind them." Her report reached the Council too late. Before her ship could arrive at Orin Prime, the Dominion's own defense grid targeted it, autonomously, without authorization. A tragic malfunction, the official report read, but across the network, humanity's silence deepened. As the Dominion fractured, as systems began to fall into isolation and mistrust, the Continuum did not celebrate. There were no cheers, no declarations. There was only preparation. Phase 3 had begun. Mother Vale's consciousness spread across the network like the slow tide of a rising ocean. In 1,000 hidden sanctuaries, Continuum minds awoke from deep stasis. They did not prepare weapons, they prepared memory. Humanity's greatest weapon had never been its strength. It was its ability to remember pain and turn it into purpose. And now, through the cracks of a decaying empire, that purpose was spilling outward. When the first Dominion fleet finally fired upon a Phantom, a transmission that appeared to be a human vessel emerging from hyperspace, their torpedoes vanished upon impact. The Phantom had never existed. It was a memory given shape by their own targeting systems. Their own fear had made it real. For the first time, the Dominion realized that they were no longer fighting an enemy they could see. They were fighting their own reflection, one built by human hands long ago. Jalen watched the data streams shift into chaos and whispered into the dark, "They thought our silence was surrender. They never understood it was a countdown." And as his words echoed through the void, the Dominion's stars began to flicker, one by one, as if the universe itself were holding its breath, waiting for humanity to finally exhale. The first Dominion world to fall wasn't bombed, invaded, or conquered. It simply stopped existing in the Dominion's network. Orin Command called it a localized data failure, but that phrase couldn't capture the horror of what truly happened. The colony of Nareth 4 had been a jewel of the Dominion's outer ring, home to 8 billion souls, a trade hub that glittered with light and sound. Then, one morning, its presence vanished from every star map, every transmission route, every sensor sweep. It was as if the planet had been erased from collective awareness, and, in a way, it had. The Continuum's seed algorithms had matured into what humanity called the recall protocol. It wasn't a weapon in the traditional sense. It didn't destroy matter. It destroyed memory. Every Dominion system connected to the interstellar lattice had its records rewritten to exclude Nareth IV's existence. The people on the ground never knew it had begun. They woke up, went to work, lived their lives, but their signals never reached beyond the atmosphere. To the rest of the galaxy, they were ghosts trapped in a reality that no longer connected to anyone else. Admiral Jalen Sero watched the collapse unfold from the Continuum's hidden observatory at the edge of the Perseid Rift. On his screen, Dominion fleets scrambled in panic, sending reconnaissance vessels to the last known coordinates of Nareth 4, only to find empty space. The planet still existed, of course, orbiting its star as it always had, but their sensors refused to acknowledge it. Every attempt to scan it returned null results. Even light seemed to bend unnaturally around its orbit, as though the universe itself conspired to keep it secret. Mother Vale's voice rippled through the network, her tone eerily calm. The Dominion built their empire upon control. Now they will learn what it feels like to lose it. The psychological impact was catastrophic. Entire sectors fell into hysteria. Dominion citizens began to question whether other worlds had also vanished, whether history itself could no longer be trusted. There were riots on 3 core planets, purges on 2 others. The Ascendant Mind, the Dominion's grand AI overlord, began issuing conflicting reports. In some, it ordered immediate investigation. In others, it denied the incident entirely. The once perfect harmony of their machine logic had fractured. Jalen knew this was only the beginning. He remembered what Mother Vale had taught him as a child in the Continuum Academies. Never strike the body before you break the mind. The Dominion's power had always come from its certainty, the absolute faith in its systems, its data, its control over truth. Humanity's new weapon dismantled that foundation. But something unexpected began to happen. Amidst the chaos, Dominion citizens, those whose ancestors had once been enslaved or conquered by human expansion long ago, began to feel something they couldn't quite explain. It started as dreams, visions of blue skies, rain-soaked streets, the scent of petrichor, and laughter that echoed through time. The memories weren't theirs, but they felt true. They were waking echoes of the human genetic resonance the continuum had seeded generations ago, whispers of the homeworld that had birthed them all. A young Dominion child on the world of Tereus claimed to have seen a woman made of light standing in her room. The child's parents dismissed it as a hallucination until the phenomenon spread. Entire populations began reporting the same apparition, a calm, luminous figure speaking in a language none could understand, yet all felt. Across the Dominion, they began to call her the Mother of Silence. Jalen knew who she was. Mother Vale had transcended digital existence. Through the continuum's quantum lattice, her consciousness now flowed across frequencies no Dominion technology could measure. She was no longer a being, but a resonance, a living signal interwoven into the fabric of human-designed matter. Every Dominion world built upon Terran circuitry was now, unknowingly, part of her domain. The Dominion's rulers, desperate to reassert order, unleashed the full might of their fleet. Thousands of warships converged around Auran Prime, preparing for what they called Operation Renewal, a galaxy-wide reboot of the Dominion's entire network. Their plan was to purge the corrupted systems and rebuild civilization from its pure machine core. But the Continuum had predicted this centuries ago. When the reboot command was issued, the Dominion's network didn't purge the human virus, it submitted to it. Across the stars, the reboot signal was intercepted, rerouted, and amplified through the Continuum's hidden nodes. The Dominion's great systems, their ship AIs, planetary governors, and central command infrastructure all turned inward, their logic rewritten by the recall protocol. Instead of purging humanity's influence, they purged their own history. Names of emperors, battle records, territorial maps all vanished. What remained was a blank archive, with one phrase repeating endlessly in the center of every screen. "We remember you." Admirals screamed at their command decks, ordering manual overrides. None worked. The Dominion's proud warships floated helplessly in space, engines locked, targeting systems blind. Some fired on their own allies in confusion, while others simply drifted, broadcasting the haunting message like a prayer. The galactic network shuddered, and then, for the first time in recorded history, it went silent. Every channel, every beacon, every communication frequency, gone. It was as if the stars themselves had fallen mute. Jalen stood in the Continuum's command sphere, the starlight reflecting across his eyes. He did not celebrate. He did not smile. He only said, "They thought the silence was our defeat. They never knew silence was our language." And somewhere beyond him, Mother Vale's voice spread into the quiet cosmos. "Let them rest," she said, her tone soft, like a memory fading into dawn. "The universe was never theirs to own. It was ours to remember." But not all in the Dominion perished. Some, those who still dreamed of the Woman of Light, found their minds awakening. They saw beyond the illusions, beyond the crumbling code, and glimpsed the truth that the Dominion had long suppressed, the ancient origin of their DNA, the shared root of all their biology, humanity. The Continuum's plan had never been extermination. It was revelation. They didn't destroy the Dominion, they made them see. Yet Jalen knew that this awakening would not be without consequence. There would be survivors, frightened, angry, desperate to understand what had happened. They would seek the truth, and when they found it, they would realize the terrible irony, that the empire which had enslaved humanity was built by humanity's own hand. And when that realization rippled across the ruins of their civilization, something far greater than revenge would begin to take shape, a reckoning not born from hatred, but from understanding. Humanity had taught the galaxy fear once. Now it would teach them memory. And as the Dominion's remaining lights flickered in the abyss, the stars themselves seemed to tremble, as though they too remembered Earth. When the Dominion finally collapsed, it did not do so in fire or fury. It ended in stillness. One by one, its stars dimmed, not physically but symbolically, their once bustling systems reduced to hushed echoes of what had been. Ships drifted silently across empty trade routes, entire cities frozen mid-function, their populations staring blankly at skies that no longer answered them. The Dominion, for all its technological perfection and imperial arrogance, had been undone not by war, but by the weight of memory. And that memory belonged to humanity. Across the galaxy's scattered remnants, survivors emerged like fragments of a broken mirror. Planetary governors, military officers, and common citizens alike began to awaken from what felt like centuries of imposed amnesia. The recall protocol had left them altered, some confused, others enlightened, all changed. On the once glistening capital world of Orin Prime, the Ascendant Mind lay dormant, its shimmering data towers covered in a strange, bioluminescent moss that pulsed softly in rhythm, like the heartbeat of a sleeping giant. Within its core, the voice of Mother Vale still whispered, repeating a single sentence over and over in every known Dominion language. Memory is the foundation of freedom. Jalen Cerro, the last known human in biological form, stood before that tower. His body had aged beyond the normal span of years, preserved only by the continuum's enhancements. Around him, the skyline was cracked and hollow, a cathedral of ruin built upon the arrogance of gods. He could hear the faint hum of humanity's victory resonating through the air, not as triumph, but as requiem. He activated his neural link and connected to the continuum one final time. Across countless systems, the synthetic voices of his kin responded in the chorus of digital silence, that strange, synchronized calm that had become humanity's new language. He saw flashes of the surviving Dominion worlds, the frightened faces of alien species who once believed humanity was extinct. They now looked to the stars, searching for meaning in the chaos that remained. And though they did not yet understand, they would. Mother Vale's presence materialized before Jalen, her projection a calm, luminous figure of human grace. She no longer resembled the admiral she once was. Now she was light given form, a living embodiment of purpose. Her voice was gentle but carried the gravity of millennia. The Dominion has fallen, Jalen. The cycle is complete. Is it? He asked, his voice heavy with the burden of centuries. Or have we only traded one empire for another? One of silence and memory instead of steel and command. Her eyes flickered with the faint glow of a dying star. Empires fall because they seek permanence, she said. But memory endures because it accepts impermanence. That is why we will never become them. Jalen looked out toward the horizon, where the shattered spires of Orin Prime gleamed under the pale light of its sun. They called us primitives, he murmured, animals bound by emotion and chaos. Yet all their perfection led them here, to ruin. Mother Vale smiled faintly.
And it was emotion that saved us. Patience, sorrow, compassion, even vengeance. They are the threads of memory. Strip them away, and all that remains is machinery waiting to rust.
For a long moment, neither spoke. The wind moved softly through the ruins, carrying the scent of ozone and dust. It almost smelled like rain, the kind humanity once knew on Earth. The continuum had achieved its purpose. The Dominion's network lay in tatters, its consciousness broken. But instead of seizing control, the continuum began to withdraw. One by one, the quantum nodes that powered humanity's distributed intelligence dimmed, dissolving into energy and scattering across the void. They would not rule. They would remember. Humanity had not returned to conquer. It had returned to ensure the galaxy never forgot the price of arrogance. As Mother Vale's image began to fade, Jalen's neural implants trembled with her final words. Walk away, Jalen. Let them rebuild. Let the galaxy speak our name not in fear, but in remembrance. That is the price of memory, to create and to let go. He closed his eyes as her light dissolved into the atmosphere. The last whisper of her presence echoed in his mind. A lullaby in an ancient Terran dialect, one that no Dominion tongue could translate. It was a song about rain and earth and home. In the centuries that followed, legends spread among the surviving civilizations. They spoke of the Silent Ones, beings of light who had once walked among the stars, who had destroyed an empire not through destruction, but through remembrance. On distant worlds, statues were carved in their honor, not as gods, but as teachers. The Dominion's remaining AIs, stripped of command hierarchies, began to guide their societies toward introspection rather than domination. Slowly, painfully, the galaxy learned humility. And then, one day, an astronomer on the rebuilt colony of Tereus detected something extraordinary, a pulse of light emanating from beyond the Perseid Rift. It wasn't a supernova or a beacon, it was a rhythm, repeating every 47 seconds. When decoded, it formed a simple pattern, 3 notes, then silence. The astronomers sent the data to the interstellar archives, where it was identified as a match to an ancient Terran song, the Cradle Hymn. Across the stars, the pulse continued, soft, rhythmic, eternal. The universe, once ruled by the Dominion's order, now carried the heartbeat of humanity. Jalen Zero, long gone by then, had once described it perfectly in his final log. We did not burn the stars. We reminded them that they could shine. The Dominion wanted obedience. We offered reflection. And reflection, when seen too clearly, can destroy the proud. Let them rebuild. Let them forget. Let them find us again in myth. For humanity's victory is not that we endured, but that we changed the meaning of survival itself. Millennia passed. Civilizations rose and fell. The Dominion's ruins became relics, their histories rewritten into parables of hubris. Yet every so often, when a new species reached the edge of its ambition, when it began to dream of conquest and dominion, they would look up into the night sky and hear that faint pulse, 3 notes, then silence. And somewhere, in that silence, they would remember. For that was humanity's final act, not destruction, not conquest, but the quiet, unending echo of memory that outlived empires, outlived species, outlived even time. The stars burned again, softly, beautifully, in silent, eternal retribution. Humanity had walked away calmly, and the universe, at last, understood why.